Today's lecture is sponsored by Rabbi Yaakov and Lisa Traeger. Ilui Nishmas Yaakov's father, Usher Ruvain Ben Eliezer, Chaplain Bruce and Judy Bublik, and also Nachman and Devorah Weinstock. Thank them for sponsoring as well. As we've said before in years past, Tisha B'Av is a time where we're not supposed to learn Torah. The basic idea of what we should try to achieve on Tisha B'Av is a feeling of sadness, a recognition of the sadness of the day, and a recognition of what we lost. Ultimately, that should lead to a sense of rectifying what we did, as we know that sinas chinam, baseless hatred, was the reason for the destruction of the last Beis Mikdash. The Chafetz Chaim writes in his works that therefore, having sinas chinam, baseless hatred, still rampant among us, so therefore it's as if the Beis Mikdash is being destroyed again. In Tisha B'Av, we're precluded therefore from doing things which bring us into a state of simcha. One of those things is learning Torah, because the verse says, Pekudei Hashem Yishar Mesamchei Lev. The teachings of Hashem are straight, are good, Mesamchei Lev. They cause people to be happy. So Tisha B'Av is really a time to be able to relate those unfortunate incidences in our lives, in our history, which we're still mourning for, cause us to be in a state of sadness. Today, we're going to discuss the personality of Jacob Frank and the movement called Frankism. Many of you have told me privately that you've never heard of him. The reality is, although we don't have exact figures, probably he was the cause for the greatest mass conversion, willingly, on their own accord, of Jews to the Roman Catholic Church, maybe in history. Between 1757 and between 1791, 35-year period, we don't have exact numbers because Jews didn't keep numbers, and it's hard to know exactly. We would have to go to baptismal records. But it's very possible that more than 30,000 Jews were baptized and converted to Roman Catholicism. And therefore that's a terrible tragedy, that 30,000 of our brethren were lost. There's a famous statement which appears in the Sefer Shivchei Habesh, the writings of the Baal Shem Tov. Mefursamim hadvarim sha'amar Habesh. It's very well known, the words that the Besh said. Shashchina mi'aleles va'omeres, that the Shechina, Hashem's presence, is crying, is sobbing, and saying, as long as the limb is still attached to the body, there's hope. Sheyelo ezer refuah. As long as the limb remains attached to the body, there's always that hope. Tikva, limb which is sick, will have some sort of refuah, which have some sort of healing. And when the limb is cut off, is removed from the body, ein lo takana olamis. The limb can never be reattached to the body. Ki kol echad mi Yisrael hu ever mashchina. Every one of the Jewish people is considered an aver, is considered a limb, a body part of the Shechina, of Klal Yisrael. And this was attributed to the Baal Shem Tov. He found out that there was this mass conversion of Jews. Remember, the Baal Shem Tov lives from 1700 to 1760, and the conversion of the Jews begins 1759, 1760. Again, these things are hard to verify, and I certainly don't present them as cold, unadulterated facts. But again, in certain Hasidic lore has it, that that was one of the cause of the Baal Shem Tov's unfortunate demise at only 60 years old, that when this mass conversion of Jews to Roman Catholicism took place, it was so affected, he was so impacted, he was so distraught over the loss of so many of Jews to on their own, consensually on their own to convert, that actually led to his untimely death. Again, in all fairness, I have to be honest, there are those who claim that especially nowadays where there's so much work in manuscripts and more libraries being open to Jewish scholars than ever before, I did notice that there are those who claim that 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 section of the it's called the sefer called Shivchei Abesh. It's a sefer it's basically a book about all types of anecdotal. He didn't write the book, the Baal Shem Tov. It's a book about him, all types of anecdotal things that he said or occurred. It's all stories. There are those who claim that originally one of the original manuscripts was in Yiddish. That section doesn't apply. Either way, whether the Baal Shem Tov said it or not, I think we can relate to that. And interesting, many though Jews, in fact the majority of Jews and the majority of rabbis actually though celebrated when the conversion of these people took place. They actually celebrated their exodus from the Jewish people. It's interesting that Shmuel Yosef Agnon, who was a Nobel Prize winner, the Nobel Prize laureate in literature from Israel, he writes the following. He writes, "We are only dust under the feet of this holy man, the best. Yet we dare be of another opinion. Frank and his gang were not a limb of the body of Israel. Rather, they were a pathological disease. Praise and thanks to our doctors who cut it off in time before it took root in our body. Undoubtedly, Frank and his group were descendants of foreign rabble," the Hebrew reads Erev Rav, "who tacked itself across to Klal Yisrael during the exodus from Egypt and followed it thereafter in the desert into the land of Israel, and later they continued to follow us to the exile. This multitude defiled the purity of Israel and defiled its holiness. May we be freed from them forever." This sentiment was echoed certainly by none other than Rav Yaakov Emden, who's going to be one of the key players in our story. So let's begin. Who was Jacob Frank? What was his movement? And what occurred? So Jacob Frank is born either in 1725 or in 1726. He's born at a time where Poland and Lithuania were actually of one country. There was this greater commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania. It's hard to see it, even if you were close, you wouldn't really get much out of it. But basically, basically what we have over here is Lithuania on the top, Poland and what is Ukraine is really on the bottom, and the area we're talking about is Podolia. Now Podolia actually figures a few times on the map. There's Podolia here, there's another Podolia here. Okay, Greater Podolia, Galicia, Podolia, southern Poland. Southern Poland is the area that we're discussing over here. Around this area, probably around here, in a town called Bushnitz, that's where Frank is born in 1726. Almost most of his life, he spent a number of his life part of in the Ottoman Empire, which actually part of present-day Ukraine was part of the Ottoman Empire for a while. But his famous work is really done in Podolia, this area of southern Poland, which is the hotbed of, honestly, a hotbed of Sabbatianism, which actually, which you'll see in a minute, leads us very well to what Jacob Frank was all about. But most of his life's work was in this area of southern Poland, Podolia. So let's understand Jacob Frank, and let's see what exactly he did and why the tragedy of this story of what exactly this happened. In order to give context to Jacob Frank in his life, and for him to understand where he came from and what he was born into, it's important to us to understand, to go back to Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi, which I think we discussed here once 13, 14 years ago in the Tisha B'Av class, he becomes he obviously is a false messiah. He obviously is a false messiah, and he declared himself messiah in the 1600s. We all know that approximately, I think, 1656, he converts to Islam. He puts on a turban and he converts to Islam, and unfortunately, the messianic hopes which were people put into Shabtai Tzvi were obviously dashed. However, even though he dies in 1666, or even though he dies, that did not end the movement. That did not end the movement, which from now on we'll just refer to the Sabbatian movement. Shabtai Tzvi, Shabtaut in Hebrew, or the Sabbatian movement in English. The Sabbatian movement, unfortunately, was alive and well even after the death of Shabtai Tzvi. How could that be? How could that be? Shabtai Tzvi converts to Islam, and how could that be that, basically, how could it be that he's still considered the Mashiach, that he's still considered a Messiah? I mean, he converted to Islam. So the answer is, and we mentioned this when we discussed dealing with Shabtai Tzvi, is that these issues are obviously very difficult for us as Orthodox Torah Jews to discuss. It's not, honestly, it's not pleasurable. It's not something of a pleasant memory that this false Messiah came. Sometimes contrary to, again, for lack of a better term, revisionist historians. But generally, when Shabtai Tzvi is taught or mentioned, in most times, if it's mentioned in the Jewish history course in the yeshiva setting, what I would imagine in a Beis Yaakov setting, for all the right reasons. For all the right reasons, he's basically presented as a fringe movement, which maybe a few outliers got excited about, but certainly the rabbinical position, all the prominent rabbis and all the prominent rank and file of the Jewish people were not taken in by this, by his shenanigans, by this false Messiah. The reality seems to be different. Reality seems to be quite different. The reality seems to be that the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people were under the assumption that Shabtai Tzvi was the Mashiach, including majority of rabbis. And we know, for instance, factually, that no one less than the Taz, who was one of the Gedolei Ador of that time, he himself was, he sent his son to be choker, to look into who this man was, and he came back with a positive response. The reality was that most of Jewry believed that this was the times of the Mashiach. We have diaries of people who lived during that time throughout Europe, and people were selling their homes. People were preparing for that the Mashiach is going to come. That shouldn't be strange to anybody really to really imagine. Obviously, by the way, especially after Tach V'Tat, the horrific Cossack problems of 1648 to 1649, obviously there was a tremendous feeling of a spiritual low, and we do have this idea that at the lowest point the Mashiach could come, and therefore, and plus he had a tremendously good publicist, Shabtai Tzvi, and Nathan of Gaza, and Nassan of Gaza. He certainly was a great publicist. And to be honest with you, we live in the age of, not that there aren't, by the way, and I'm sure we all can understand this, not that there aren't plenty of conspiracy theories out there that people buy into. again, I'm so hesitant to mention any because there very well could be people in this room who, I don't want to question anyone's private beliefs here, but those of us, which I imagine is everybody here in the room, who lived through COVID, again, I'm not going to name names or go into examples, but, perhaps one of the most famous or well-known, or certainly an iconic American name, I guess the family is as akin to royalty as American can offer up, is running for a position on the, at least supposed position as a Democratic candidate for the presidency in the next year. He certainly espouses what some people would consider certainly conspiracy theories, both in his attitudes towards vaccination, et cetera. But on the other hand, there are probably millions of the people in this country who probably believe that way as well. So I'm not really convinced that the 21st century, with our skepticism or hard evidence and the science, I'm not really convinced that we're so better off. But certainly in an age where basically everything was just word of mouth and mouth to ear, and then you can imagine that when people said Mashiach is here, and people said, yeah, and Rabbanim were believing it, so it spread like wildfire. And again, I stress again, the times that they were living in were times, remember this is after the time of the Arizal, right after the time of the Arizal, Lurianic Kabbalah, the study of Kabbalah and the idea of Tikkun Olam, the idea of the world being corrected and going into some sort of messianic age, was rampant. So the fact that the majority of Jewish people why wouldn't you believe? Why wouldn't? There was a person that said Mashiach is here, and you heard that most Rabbanim were saying, why not? He probably is here. And so there wouldn't be any really reason not to believe it. And there were plenty of miracles attributed to Shabtai Tzvi. And honestly, even after he converts to Islam, for the next 10 years, he continues to hold court. He never fully, honestly, it's not like he becomes a full card-carrying Muslim either. He still has this sort of mixed bag. So what happened was that honestly, the combination of messianic fervor and this combination of messianic fervor and this want of Mashiach to be there, that's really the only way I can explain that the death of Shabtai Tzvi in 1666, 1670, it didn't stop the movement. But what obviously it did stop, it stopped to a certain extent the belief that he himself, let's say, is the Mashiach. I'm not going to get into the discussion of is the Jewish Mashiach, can he come from the dead, can he not come from the dead? That's another, whatever, issue fraught with passions, which I'd rather not touch today. But suffice to say, what happened was there began what was called crypto-Sabbatianism. Crypto-Sabbatianism is basically quiet Sabbatianism or under-the-table Sabbatianism, to the belief that we're still in some sort of messianic time, and that some of the ideas of Shabtai Tzvi, whether or not he precisely is the messianic figure, but the idea that we're in a messianic time, and there are certain Kabbalistic things that we can, if we believe in, we can bring about the Mashiach, these were still very popular and very rampant. Now, honestly, again, and I stress, it's not so different than our times. So if I can give an example which could be provocative, but I don't want to be provocative, okay? But I'll just be provocative to keep you awake on Tisha B'Av. It's 5:30 in the afternoon. But let's go to COVID and the vaccines. So it's not like, I mean, there were people like this, don't get me wrong, but it's not like, well, there were clearly divided camps. There was everybody who was pro-vaccine totally made sure that as soon as the first day, please don't raise your hand, and please, let's not comment on this, let's just move along. But it's not like when every booster came out, every person made sure to get to CVS that day and get Moderna booster or the Johnson & Johnson booster. There were a lot of various opinions. There were some people who said, I don't want the shot. There were some people who said, I do want the shot. There were some people who wanted to make a bracha when the vaccine came. There were some people who said, the vaccine ruined my life, COVID ruined my life, long COVID ruined my life, short COVID ruined my life. We unfortunately, there was like a lot of, and even now, everybody getting their boosters, they're not getting their boosters. Was it good we were masked? Was it bad we were masked? Was it proper, was it masked? Was the government proper? It's not two opinions. It's not like, the Republicans versus the Democrats precisely, and everybody is voting in a block one way. There were various, honestly, degrees and variations and camps. And frankly, they didn't necessarily even divide into groups. Individuals, people had their own, even within the families. A wife might have opted for more boosters, a husband may have opted for less, whatever it was. There was, believe me, I heard much too much, and I would have rather heard about we all remember the passions which went on. So back to crypto-Sabbatianism. The idea that the time of Shabtai Tzvi was a messianic era and tied to some of the beliefs of Shabtai Tzvi was alive and well for over 100 years after the death of Shabtai Tzvi. Let's be very provocative. Some of us have heard of two rabbis who lived literally as if one lived on High Street, across the street from the Havas, and whatever the other lived, let's just say on High Street, across the street from Tennyson Park. Well, there were two great rabbis who basically lived maybe even closer to each other in a Jewish community which had 200 Orthodox families in the 1750s. And both of them are very famous rabbis. One is named, and both of them lived in the same town, Altena. Altena is a town in northern Germany. They were, in fact, three small, prominent, but not huge, three Jewish communities which formed a triangle in northern Germany, bordering now it's all northern Germany. At one point, one of the cities was in southern Denmark. But at that point, all three were now they're all in Germany. It's Kehilas Ahu, Altena, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. Those three Kehilas, Aleph, Hey, Vav, Altena, Hamburg, and Wandsbek, they're all in a little bit the northeastern corner of Germany, bordering on Denmark almost. And at that point, Hamburg was actually in Denmark. And now they're all part of, I think, the greater metropolitan area of Hamburg. But in Altena, they had only one rabbi. These three communities had one rabbi, because they called themselves Kilas Ahu. Kilas Ahu, one Kihila, Aleph, Hey, Vav. They had one rabbi for all three communities. It was a very prestigious post, very prestigious post. In 1750, the rabbi of Kilas Ahu was appointed by the name of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, who would pass away in 1764, is a very famous rabbi. He had a very great yeshiva. He had many, many talmidim. He was one of the greatest rabbis and Rosh Yeshivas of his generations. Many of us still study his works. His work on Shulchan Aruch, Crazy Places works, his commentary on the Chumash. He certainly, I'm sorry to use this term, but just for whatever the proverbial term, but he's certainly in the pantheon of Gedolei Yisrael. He's certainly a known person that you can mention as an accepted person. And he was the chief rabbi of Ahu. Down the block from him lived another famous person whose name was Yaakov Emden. His name was Yaakov Emden. And this man, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, he had a very famous father. His father was called the Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi. And the Chacham Tzvi was a rabbi in Emden, was rabbi in Ahu. And one of his children, he had like 10, 11, 12 children. One of his children was Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And he was, we'll talk about him as we go on, but he's certainly very well known. There's not a person here who studies rabbinic literature, who hasn't looked at his Peirish Shari Shemayim on the Siddur, Shelis Yavitz. The reason it's called Yavitz, Yavitz is Yud. Besides that, it appears twice in Tanakh, once as a name and once as a place, but it's Yaakov ben Tzvi, Yud Ayin Beis Tzi, Yavitz. That's how he would sign his name, Yavitz, Yaakov ben Tzvi. One day, when he would watch his father was the chief rabbi, Chacham Tzvi, would write letters. He once asked his father, "Why do you sign your names Tzvi?" I don't know if any of you have ever noticed, but if you ever find old letters or old approbations, haskamas from Mordechai Kivta, Zechron Bracha, he always would sign it just Mordechai. So that's how Chacham Tzvi always signed his letters Tzvi. So one day his son asked him, Rav Yaakov asked him, "Hey, Dad, how come you always sign your letters just Tzvi? Not like, I don't know, a little bit more formal." So he says, "No, I didn't write, haven't be my name Tzvi, but there's a rabbinic trick to it. Because my father's name, your grandfather is Yaakov. So Tzvi is Tzvi ben Yaakov. Tzvi is really Tzvi ben Yaakov. So I'm really not writing just Tzvi. I'm really Tzvi ben Yaakov. That's how I'm called to the Torah. Just appears as Tzvi." And then he told his son, when you become big and you write Shuvas, you're going to sign your name Yavitz. Because he obviously knew the word that appears, and the name appears in Yavitz, and that was a good chap. Yaakov ben Tzvi. Yaakov, he was the chap ben Tzvi, as opposed to Tzvi ben Yaakov. He was Yaakov ben Tzvi. Anyway, Rav Yaakov Emden lived for a while. He wanted to, maybe he did want to be. On one hand, just a little bit about him. It'd be worthwhile always to talk about him. A very fascinating individual. Just to give you an idea, notwithstanding that he said that he would make the brachas in the morning, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu shelo asani aved, he said he would have in mind that the ayin and the aleph would switch, and instead of saying shelo asani aved, then he didn't make me a slave, shelo asani aved, with an aleph, meaning an av beis din, meaning a rabbi. Thank you for not making me a rabbi. He was a businessman. He owned a printing press. He actually got permission from the king of Denmark to how you needed rishus back then to run a printing press. He had rishus, and that's how he made money. He printed books. Anyway, after being a rabbi, how did he get the name Emden? For a very short time, like 2 years. By his own admission, like I just told you, by his own admission, he was not cut out to be a rabbi. I'm not sure who is cut out to be a rabbi. But he certainly was not cut out to be a rabbi by his own admission. And he was, for a very short time, he was the rabbi of a city called Emden in Germany for a very short time. And then he went back home to his hometown, most probably in the hope of getting the rabbinate there and inheriting his father's position, which would never happen. But he goes back to Altena, where he lives. And on one day in 1751, so he was now it must have been, back then, you should know, not like today. Like today, Baruch Hashem, right now, if you want to open a shul, open a shul. Go to one of the storefronts on Main Avenue, put down a deposit on a store, and say, this is Kahal Anshe Chesed, whatever you want to call it. And you have a shul. In fact, here in Passaic, I think the last year, 2 or 3 shuls, Baruch Hashem, opened up. New shul opened up. Old pizza store is now a shul. This is a shul. Good, Baruch Hashem. We like shuls. Probably find nice shuls. You don't need permission. Certainly don't need permission from me. You don't need permission from any rabbi. You don't need permission from a Hector Laura. You don't need permission from anyone to open a shul. But back then, when there was a kehillah system, you couldn't open a shul. because Kehillah was very, very cohesive. So Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz saw right away when Rabbi Yaakov Emden, one of his Balabatim, that the former rabbi's son was one of his congregants, and he was a congregant who was not a quiet person who sat in the back. He made sure that his opinion was known and felt. So he was granted permission by the Kehillah of Altona to open up a minyan in his house of not more than 11 people. He was allowed 11 people. If one person is sick, you can still have your minyan. Anyway, one fine Thursday afternoon, he got up and he announced that everyone loves the Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz. Everyone loves him. This is 1751. Everyone loves him. Well, you should know he's not a person you should love. He's a Sabbatian. He's a believer in Shabtai Tzvi. He's a believer in Shabtai Tzvi. He believed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah, and I have amulets to prove it. Now, amulets, or kameyas, were very common back then. In certain circles, they still are. I'm sure there are certain circles, certainly in Israel, that you can go to get amulets. And there are people who write you these amulets. They're Kabbalistic powers. Certainly, I'd be the wrong person to go to for such a thing or to explain such a thing. But I don't know exactly how they work, what their powers are, but definitely there are, and there were, people who believed in them, and great holy people, when they wrote you an amulet and you kept it with you. And I've seen amulets, anyone can see them online. They're basically a configuration of Hebrew letters which cannot be read in any, the normal human being cannot read them and understand them. They don't say like have a refuah shleima or find a shidduch or something like that. They don't say that at all. They don't form words. They just are letters seemingly randomly placed, but obviously they have Kabbalistic significance of the placement of the letters. And I imagine one who holds on to one of these kameyas, these amulets, will be protected or achieve whatever their spiritual goals are. They'll have a greater success rate. Anyway, Rabbi Emden, he got up in his little shul of 11 people, and he announced very quickly that I have amulets by Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz, and he's a Sabbatian. I could prove it that these amulets clearly state on them that I believe that in them is, embedded in those is the thing is I'm a believer in Shabtai Tzvi. I'm a believer in Shabtai Tzvi that he was the Messiah. Now, this caused, frankly, probably the greatest controversy in the 18th century that stunned world Jewry. In fact, it so stunned world Jewry, and at that point, a rabbinate had the power of cherem. Cherem meant you could theoretically excommunicate you. And if you're excommunicated, theoretically, you were not allowed to get an aliyah in shul. Nobody could come within 4 cubits, 4 amos of you. People would not speak to you. They would not allow you in shul. You couldn't say Kaddish. There were a lot of restrictions put on you. So as the saying goes, if you were a rabbi in the 18th century, you weren't much of a rabbi if somebody didn't put you in cherem. The Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz controversy about whether he's a Sabbatian or was not a Sabbatian was so fierce, was so vicious and so fierce that we have records of the stock market in Hamburg being closed because there were fist fighting. There was fist fighting going on between. Unfortunately, there was fist fighting going on about on the stock market one day as far as the who was right. And basically, you had everybody was involved. Now, just that you shouldn't, again, it's probably good and it's probably better that this information is more or less repressed. It is. For understanding of today, we'll talk about it a little, but it probably is better because at the end of the day, Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz was a great man, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden has very important svarim as well. And both of them have a place in our Masorah. But nevertheless, it is important to know that that Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz, which most people would assume, of course, he was not a Sabbatian, but you should know that 2 of the greatest rabbis of the 18th century, And the 18th century was a century of rabbis. I mean, you talk about big rabbis, everybody lived in the 18th century. But probably the Zokin Hador, the Gadol Hador, certainly in the 1750s and 1760s, was a man named Rabbi Falk, Yoshua Falk, who was also known as the Pnei Yoshua. And the Pnei Yoshua, he was a great Rav, a great Rav, and he believed with all his being, the Emunah Shlema, that Yonasan Abshitz was a Sabbatian. We have letters. We have letters clearly stating, with his signature on them, that the Pnei Yoshua believed that Rabbi Yonasan Abshitz was indeed a believer in the Messianic movement of Shabtai Tzvi. Now, how does that jive? How does that jive? And it's important that I tell you that, because how does that jive with a man whose Sfarim we still use today, whose Sfarim are unbelievable? We don't come to his ankles in scholarship, in Lumdis, in being a Talmud Chacham, in being, like I said, part of the Masorah. How can it be that the Pnei Yoshua, is the Pnei Yoshua wrong? Potentially, but potentially not wrong. So how, if he's not wrong, how does that jive? I'll tell you how it jives. Back to, excuse me, our analogy of COVID. Meaning there were people who were, unfortunately, who were such anti-maskers that they made it their business that wherever they went, they're not going to wear a mask. And there are some people that are still wearing masks. And there were many, many people in between. If they went to a place where people wore masks, they did. They wore them under their nose, above their nose. Again, let's leave COVID. But the reality is that belief in Sabbatianism did not mean you weren't a Shomer Torah mitzvos. And that I want to make very clear in our discussion today. If there were aspects of your belief that adopted and embraced Sabbatianism, and again, I'm not, and I don't know if anybody is anymore, so familiar with the actual Kabbalistic concepts that I'm able to delineate in a cogent fashion what exactly Rabbi Yonasan Abshitz believed in and what he did not believe in. But I can tell you that belief in Sabbatianism did not and was not an impediment, and was certainly not mutually exclusive to being a great Torah scholar and to being meticulous in your Torah observance. Just to give you an example of my research, and I sent this to my sons in Israel, particularly my son in the Old City, Mayor, but I've often told you, I've often written to you, well, I'm proud of it, not personally proud, just proud of Hashem. Yeah, I'm thankful to Hashem. Not really, I didn't do anything, but I'm thankful to Hashem that my grandchildren daven in the same shul that my five greats, my great grandfather founded in 1836. And isn't that fantastic? Just to think of thankful to God. I'm so thankful to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Who else can say, who would want to say anyway? Who would want to say, who would want to daven in the same shul in Berlin where your great-grandfather, who would want to be there? And if you came from Kentucky, I can guarantee your grandchildren aren't davening in the same shul that your grandparents davened in Kentucky. And they came from Warsaw, they're certainly not there because there's only, unless they're in the cemetery. So no one could say it. But thankfully, Baruch Hashem, that's a nice thing. So it happens to be that shul is called the Churva Shul. The Churva Shul. Many of you have been to the shul. Who hasn't been in Eretz Yisrael and been to the Churva? Isn't that a funny name for a shul? You ever notice that? You ask yourself the question. We're going to the destroyed shul. Okay, that's a nice shul here. Air conditioning. Why you call? We don't call any shuls in Pesach the destroyed shul. Why would you call a shul the destroyed shul? It's a funny name. I'll tell you why. Because in the 1660s, Sabbatian Jews, led by a man named Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, not Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, the famous German pietist of the 11th century. No, a 17th century Jew. The Jew of the 11th century is the one who wrote Sefer Hasidim. Sefer Hasidim was the one written in Germany by a German pietist who lived in the 1000s, a little bit, 1100s maybe. That Sefer Hasidim, that's one thing. There was another Jew named Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. So I'll also write HaChassid, but to differentiate, we'll just call him Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. He was a Sabbatian. He was a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. He went to Eretz Yisrael to build a shul, because that shul, building an exact spot in the old city, it's exactly configured that if you build a shul in that part, that'll bring Mashiach, that'll bring the Messiah. Unfortunately, he died very soon after. And all he left over was a half-built shul and a lot of debts. And from 1670, for like over 100 years, that shul remained a churva. It remained a churva in Yiddish just means an unfinished building can be called a churva. It was an unfinished building, a dump, an unfinished building. It happened to be that was my great-great-great-great-grandfather, one of the people who he was arranged. He went to Muhammad Ali, who was not the boxer. He went to Muhammad Ali, who was one of an Egyptian, the representative of the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic fellow in Mitzrayim in Egypt, and he got a permission to cancel the debts and allow them to rebuild the shul, and the rest is a lot of history. But the shul itself, initially, the fact that it's called Churvas Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid was most probably had some Sabbatian leanings. So my point is that being a Sabbatian didn't necessarily make you outside the fold, necessarily. If your name was Rav Yaakov Emden, then being even, maybe if you once sneezed and you said Shabtai Tzvi, that was enough to knock you outside the fold. But he was a radical anti-Sabbatian. Most people, many rabbis who were not pro-Sabbatians, were not necessarily radical anti-Sabbatians. For instance, the Posek Hador, who lived longer, was of course Rav Yechezkel Landau, the famous Rav of Prague. He was the Rav of Prague. Now, Rav Yechezkel Landau, the Noda B'Yehuda, one of the greatest Rabbanim of the 18th century, perhaps the greatest Rav, to be the Rav of Prague, of the Altneu Shul, perhaps the most prestigious rabbinical position in the entire world at that time, perhaps. The Noda B'Yehuda. What is the world, the halachic world without Noda B'Yehuda? What would it be to study Shas without the tzlach? Tzlach is called Tzion L'Nefesh Chaya. Tzion, a remembrance for the soul of a woman Chaya. That was his mother. His mother's name was Chaya. We call it tzlach. That's a commentary on the Talmud Bavli. What would the world of the Shulchan Aruch be without studying the Dogul Mirvova? Dogul Mirvova is also a sefer written by Rav Yechezkel Landau. The Noda B'Yehuda, his father's name was Yehuda, that's named after his father. He, in 1762, in 1762, just remind everyone listening on Zoom, please mute. In 1762, Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz had already spent almost 12 years fighting with Rabbi Yaakov Emden if he's a Sabbatian or not. He wanted to retire to the city of Prague, where he had lived for a while. And we have records. After the fall of the Soviet Union, these records were opened. There are records that we see that he went to the non-Jewish authorities, Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, to deny, as the representative of the Jewish people, deny Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz's request to live in the city of Prague. Because of the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs and all that, he needed special permission to be able to move back to Prague. He was on the wrong side of one of these wars at one point. And therefore, we have records. The records are now extant. The Rav Yechezkel Landau refused to have Yonasan Eibschitz live off the last 2 years of his life, like Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky lived in Monsey the last years of his life. He refused. He wanted to get away from Altena. But nevertheless, when he died in 1764, Rav Yechezkel Landau eulogized him publicly in the shul. And Rabbi Cheskel Landa was the one who orchestrated the famous compromise, the pshara, that basically we're going to stop the machlokas. This dispute that Rabbi Yaakov Emden was stirring very strongly to remove Rabbi Yonason from his post as the rabbi of Kilas Ahu. Basically, it was Yechezkel Landa who orchestrated the idea that you go to your corner, you go to your corner, and let life go on. And Rabbi Yonason Eibshin was made to sign a declaration that he's against the Sabbatean, is what he did. He was forbade to write any more amulets, which he also abided by. And besides that, life went on. He had his yeshiva, he had his kila, and the reason was because that many rabbis didn't view crypto-Sabbatianism in its mild form to be the most worst thing in the world. Again, if I can give a little bit of an example, again, only just an example. But we're all familiar with the fact that there was certainly some sort of messianic movement associated, with Lubavitch, that we all understand. And what exactly is the status of the Lubavitcher Rebbe at this point is probably, again, I'm not fluent in all Chabad philosophy, but I'm aware that there probably are different viewpoints. That doesn't preclude everybody here, and I really mean everybody basically, when you go to South Carolina, you're going to call the local Chabad, and where can I eat? I mean, I get calls all the time. People are going to Hawaii, maybe once I'll go, and they go to the Chabad here, and they get the Chabad there, and nobody ever asks me, what's their status on Messianism. And the reason is because that, whatever a person does in the privacy of their base medrash, for the most of us, it doesn't, people are observing halacha. I don't think anybody says that in Crown Heights they don't observe halacha, they don't observe kashrus. I don't think anybody says that the kashrus organization in Crown Heights is subject to any sort of, is not kosher. I don't think so. So that's much of what Sabbatianism was, for most of the part. And most rabbis were willing to, honestly, perhaps because much of it was very, very, again, it didn't change halacha. Again, if I can for a moment, tangentially, I mean, I think all of us realize, let's just say, for instance, even a person like a non-Hasidic person, Reb Chaim Kanievsky. I mean, after Reb Chaim Kanievsky passed away, nothing less than the blighted and scandalous New York Times ran an obituary on Reb Chaim Kanievsky. And they quoted a prominent American rabbi who said in the obituary in the New York Times that because he changed from wearing a down hat to an up hat, his cancer was cured, on the advice of Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Now, I'm not sure Reb Chaim Kanievsky agrees to that. I'm not sure that he believes he's an oncologist or a spiritual oncologist. I don't know. I've never discussed it with him, and obviously I will not. But I think we're all aware of the fact that there were many people who sought out Reb Chaim Kanievsky because he was a great Torah scholar. And there were many people who sought him out because they believed he had some sort of powers beyond us mortals, that if he told you to wear an up hat, he can even cure your cancer. And maybe he could. I have no idea. But my point is that didn't impact whatever you held, whatever your private belief was on his wearing wristwatches or wearing up hats or whatever they were. Whatever these semi-quasi non-halachic issues, whatever you held in, it didn't matter. It didn't affect you halachically. We're all halachic Jews. So for the most part, Sabbatianism was that, for the most part. There was also what was called radical Sabbatianism. Radical Sabbatianism, what classified radical Sabbatianism? What's called antinomianism. Antinomianism, in very simple terms, means non-observance of halacha. It's one thing if when I go to sleep at night and I believe, I don't, if I go to sleep and I believe Shabtai Tzvi is the Messiah, But in the morning, I do my Negel Wasser, I eat my Chalav Yisrael, I eat my Pas Yisrael, I observe all the 39 malachas as much as anyone else. So that's one thing. Okay, in the privacy of my home, I may hope that Mashiach is, maybe I even say some sort of, I have some sort of amulet that indicates that I'm a crypto believer, maybe. But it's another thing if I begin to change halacha. And excuse the long introduction, but that's the context to understanding not our protagonist, but our anti-protagonist, Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank is born in 1726 in Podolia. Podolia is the hotbed. This is the whole area, the hotbed of Sabbatianism. They're not an organized group, but crypto-Sabbatians who are radical in their Sabbatian beliefs, this is where they reside, in Podolia. And that's where Hasidus is born. Mezhbutz, in Podolia. That's where it was a very spiritual place, not too far from Uman, very spiritual type of place where a lot of messianism and Kabbalism and mysticism was rampant. Some good, some not so good, some very bad. He's born into a Sabbatian family. Now, the Ottoman Empire, which was reaching its pinnacle of strength, actually for a number of years, the Ottoman, Turkey's right here, but even parts over here were owned by the Ottoman Empire in sometimes the late 1600s, early 1700s. So his father moved, his father's a trader. And in Turkey, in the Ottoman, in Turkey itself, there's a group called the Donmeh, D-O-N-M-E-H, Donmeh. They are, you heard of Jews for J? They are Jews for Muhammad, Jews for M. Okay, they are Islamists who also believed in Shabtai Tzvi. So I don't know what they are exactly, but they were a mixture. They were a Sabbatian group that followed Shabtai Tzvi when he converted to Islam, but still held on to some Jewish groups. So his father moves to, his name is Leibowitz. His name is Yankel Leibowitz. He's born Yankel Leibowitz. His mother tongue is Yiddish. He's born in Poland. He's a Polish Yid, born Yankel Leibowitz. And he moves to Turkey with his father. How does he get the name Frank? So some of you may know that he's a Frank is a pejorative term. Hope nobody on Zoom realizes we're just saying it for the sake of whatever. But it's a pejorative term. To call someone a Frank in Israel now is a pejorative term for a Sephardic person. A Sephardic person being referred to as a Frank is a pejorative term. How did he become, if named Leibovich, how did he become Frank? So interesting, sort of like a reverse pejorativisms. Back then, the Sephardim would call the Europeans, to call the Polishes who came to Turkey, they would call them Franks. They called me Frank, sort of like different reasons. Some say that it had to do with French, and that was the French, whatever, the whole establishment there and that type of European living as opposed to Middle Eastern living. It was a pejorative term given to European Jews who settled in Turkey at that time. Ultimately, the Ashkenazi Jews who were called Frank, when the Sephardi Jews came to Ashkenazi land, they returned the favor and they said, you know what, I'm not a Frank, you're a Frank. So that's why he was called Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank because he was an Ashkenazi Jew living in a Muslim Ottoman society. He's born into a family of Sabbatian, radical Sabbatians. What I mean radical Sabbatians is that their halachic observance is certainly skimpy at best. And like I said, for a while he moves with his father, he gets married to a Sabbatian woman. Apparently families, whatever, obviously they made a shidduch, which was a tzugapas, where it was proper for such a Sabbatian family. And he basically, and he, well, let's just see the following. Again, I'm just using this as an example, not the same thing. But, we have the Book of Frank. Now, the Book of Frank, which was written post facto, so remember I told you at the end of the story, a spoiler, that they all converted to Roman Catholicism, so it's written in Polish, because when it was finally, like, I'm sorry to use this comparison, but a lot of, let's say, Likutei Maran of the Breslov, of Rav Nachman of Breslov, he didn't write that sefer. He didn't write that sefer. Whoever wrote the sefer, but it was written years later. And it goes by, it's a random things, teaching, sayings, that's his book. The book of Frank is certainly. So for instance, he says, I had a vision in Salonika, as though the following words were said to someone, go lead Jacob the wise, and you should go into the rooms. And he goes into this whole thing, walking into the dark. I came to the edge of a mountain, and I stopped. And then I had difficulty getting up, and I forced my way up. And then an extraordinary scent reached me, and there were true believers there. They seized me with great joy. Sweat poured from my head. And is that when I did not, I let my feet hang, and I pushed up with all my body, and I got to the top of the mountain, and I made it to the top of the mountain. I mean, there's no doubt that he was either delusional or whatever, I don't know what else, but he certainly, from an early part of his life, he believed in himself that he was a special human being. He was a special human being, and therefore he can do, and in 1752 he gets married, and then he pops up back in Poland in 1755. He returns back to Poland in 1755, and he honestly becomes one of the leaders of the radical Sabbatians. The leader of the radical Sabbatians. What is one of the things the radical Sabbatians do? So, by the way, again, I can't tell you, the classic, the best book on Sabbatianism was written in the last 20 years. It's written by Pavel, P-A-W-E-L, Maceikio, M-A-C-E-I-J-K-O. He's a man who's a very good person, and it's called the Mixed Multitude, the Erev Rav. He has his degrees from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He currently is a professor, I think, in Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He's a Polish guy. He's a Gentile. He's a non-Jew. He wrote. He's also obviously, besides being, he speaks Hebrew perfectly. He's also obviously speaks Polish perfectly. So he wrote now is definitely definitive work on Jacob Frank, called The Mixed Multitude, the Erev Rav. So just to give you an idea about him, 2 depictions of Frank were written by eyewitnesses in 1759. That's the year he converts to Roman Catholicism. One composed by the Jesuit minister described him as following, quote, Jacob Frank is a beautiful man of imposing posture, a resounding voice. The other is written by Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes, Jacob Frank was a small man, incredibly ugly, not even resembling a human being. He had the face of a demon. Again, right, my little handy-dandy thing here, you can take a look at, oh, it is the wrong side. You can look at Jacob Frank if you see if that's generally the picture. Knowing if that's really him, I have no idea. But that's generally the picture. Also, again, the priest writes the following. He writes about him what about maybe speaking ability? He was a charismatic people? Yes. So the Jesuit priest says the following. I marveled at his linguistic capabilities. Frank had mastered Hebrew, Turkish, Wallachian, Italian, German, Ladino, and French. That's quite a thing. Now we turn to Rav Yaakov Emden. Rav Yaakov Emden. Frank, quote, Frank had no command of any language or speech whatsoever. He stammered, he whistled, he cried like a rooster. Unless you were accustomed to his speech, no one in the world can understand a word uttered by him. I would imagine was somewhere in the middle, but I would imagine he had some charisma or whatever. But honestly, as Professor Mashenko points out, and I think this is very nice, one thing about Frank is as following. He was an Ashkenazi among Sephardim, a Sephardi among Ashkenazi, a Pole among Turks, a Turk among Poles, an unlearned boor among the sages, a sages among the simpletons, a believer among skeptics, a libertine among the pious. Following his conversion in 1759, he continued to be seen as a Jew among the Christians, and yet was considered a Christian among the Jews. Heinrich Graetz, one of the first biographers of Frankism, Graetz, by the way, many of you familiar, he lived in Rav Hirsch's house. Rav Hirsch was in Mannheim. Graetz lived in with Rav Hirsch. They learned together Menachos. I think they learned together Seder Kotchim. They learned together. Eventually he became, Rav Hirsch was not happy with him because he became, whatever he became. And I think he was Orthodox, I don't know. But whatever he wasn't, didn't follow the Hirschian derech. Anyway, he wrote, Graetz read about him, he's one of the worst, slyest, and most deceitful villains of the 18th century. Okay. On the other hand, a Polish Catholic Encyclopedia entry defines him as the greatest reformer of Polish Jewry in the 18th century. In short, Frank was the most mercurial of all Jewish leaders. And that I think, or whatever. So let's begin from the beginning of when he gets on the map. We go to the city of Landskrona. Landskroni. It's a city, again, in Podolia. And Jacob Frank is back in town in Poland, and he's doing his thing, whatever he was. And one of the things he believed in was called mitzvah haba ba'avera. He was a total antinomian. I mean, he believed that the way to bring Mashiach nowadays was through doing averas. Now, remember, Shabtai Tzvi did things were antinomian, but for the most part, he never preached that others should follow his way. He did some strange things. He got married to a Sefer Torah under a chuppah. That taka he did. However, for the most part, Shabtai Tzvi didn't preach to be antinomian. Here's what happened. This is from Rabbi Yaakov Emden in his sefer called Sefer Hashimish, which is almost totally devoted to Jacob Frank. You can get a copy of it. You can order it from Lulu. I did. It cost you less than $10. Be a hard time to read it because it's a printing from 1757 or 1759 and from Altena, but whatever. Anyways, I'll just read a translation. Here's what was going on in Landskrona. Here's what was going on. They took the wife of a local rabbi who also belonged to the Kat. The Kat is Yaakov Emden's word for Sabbatians. A woman beautiful, but of course lacking discretion. They undressed her naked and placed the crown of the Torah on her head, sat her under a chuppah like a bride, and danced around her. They celebrated with bread and cheese and wine of the non-Jewish people, and they played music and they made believe as if they were King David. They danced around her, fell upon her, kissed her, hugged her, called her our mezuzah, and they kissed her and hugged her as if she was a mezuzah. Now, obviously, this, and at a time when there were kehillas, such a behavior and such a demonstration of such perversion and Gilui Arayos was something obviously raised eyebrows. However, it was more than that. Because in other eyewitness accounts we find, and this was the key, I mean, there was no doubt that this, their inappropriateness with regard to carnal relationships, with regard to intimacy and Gilui Arayos, that was no doubt. But more than that, we find that the following, is that they went ahead and at the end of their ceremony of dancing, we have another account, they went ahead and they were dancing with crosses and even burnt the cross at the conclusion of the ceremonies. Now this was already different. Radical Sabbatians who engaged in all these orgiastic practices was not common, but was not unheard of. However, the bringing in of Christian symbols, the bringing in of the cross, that already raised levels to levels never heard of before. And for instance, I mean, there were other things that they had as well. Just to give you an example before I get back to the cross. But the rabbis immediately said, we have to shut down this group. And they started an investigation, the Rabbanim in Podolia, the Rabbanim who were obviously not Sabbatians, and they took testimony. And for instance, they took a testimony from a man named Rabbi Yosef, who said the following: during Passover, we were required to eat a slice of bread covered with pork. He used the word davar acher. Meshuch with davar acher. Davar acher is generally a rabbinic term meaning pig, pork. But he used the term davar acher. And we had butter and non-kosher wine. In fact, it was also common among us that every Friday night we had to have a piece of pork and cheese with our Shabbos Seudah. Other testimonies describe the breaking of the prohibition of incest, having relations with menstruating women, as well as the practice of sexual hospitality, where a host would offer his wife or his daughter to a stranger coming to a guest in his home. Indeed, another man complained to the Beis Din that he came to a fellow Sabbatian's house for Shabbos, and he refused to give him his wife, where he immediately said, why did we come here? He would not even honor us with his wife. Another man mentioned that we believe Samuel of Busk admitted in testimony there is one God in the Trinity, and the fourth person is the Holy Mother. He went ahead and admitted that he had heretical books and manuscripts of Shabtai Tzvi. He also said, Samuel Busk, that it's permissible to children to have relations with their parents, with their sister. He himself said he had carnal relations with the wife of his son, and I believe that this is permitted because nowadays God permitted us that all is permitted, matir asurim, matir isurim. So these things were obviously very profound, but honestly, what really also tipped the scales was the involvement of Christian imagery. Now, technically, there was no such thing as a separation of church and state, which meant to say that if you did something against the church, for instance, I don't know if it's going to happen, it's not going to happen, but I happened to notice today, I wish I didn't, but I happened to notice today that tomorrow, I think in Sweden, in Stockholm, there's somebody planning to burn a Sefer Torah in front of the Israeli consulate or Israeli mission to Sweden tomorrow, that they have as freedom of religion, freedom of expression, that they're planning to burn, I don't know, a Tanakh, a Sefer Torah, Be'ez Hashem, it should not happen. But supposedly the practices of freedom, that's a guaranteed. Now, we live in a society where there is a separation of church and state. There's no reason you can't go ahead and say publicly that you can't obviously promote violence, and you can't threaten anyone, and you can't do anything which would incite violence, which obviously the definition of that is something which is fraught with a lot of interpretation. But one of the freedoms we have in this country is the freedom to hate. There's freedom to hate in this country. You can say you hate Rabbi so-and-so, Father so-and-so, Minister so-and-so, Imam so-and-so. You can say that. And you may not win brownie points, but it's not illegal. It's not illegal in our country. You can't scream fire in a crowded theater. But there's nothing illegal as long as you're not inciting violence. You're even allowed in this country to, you can say. You may be, other people will argue very strongly with you and condemn you. But there's nothing illegal in this country of saying that I believe Jewish people control Hollywood. It's not illegal to say that. It's not illegal. It's protected of the First Amendment of free speech. And honestly, we have a separation of church and state here. If you say something against, notwithstanding this is a majority Christian country, and it's not as a majority Protestant country, but there's certainly a large amount of Catholics in our country. You can say things against the Pope, and you'll be protected by your freedom of speech. But that wasn't the case in Poland in the 1700s. Speaking heresy, burning a cross, doing anything which can be interpreted as being heretical to the church, or being blasphemous, or being anti-clerical to the church. So the local diocese, the local Catholic diocese in Poland is basically a 99.9% Catholic country, it still is. They would step in and they would act. So this was very scary. This was very scary. What really troubled the rabbinate was the use of the Christian symbols in the ritual, regardless of the frankest intentions to be antinomian. The use of a cross in a Jewish rite put all Jews in danger and exposed them to Christian charges of desecration and blasphemy. And the entire Jewish community was now in danger. For if the Christians, and all the way to the Pope, find out that the Jews in Poland are mocking, ridiculing, you want to not observe halacha? Okay, that's your business. Pope can look the other way. But you're burning crosses. And remember, by the way, Rav Yaakov Emden, when he recorded the eating of the bread and the wine, he referred to lechem anushin, which is a pasuk in Amos, which is clearly a reference to the Eucharist. Clearly a reference to the Catholic eating of the wafer and the wine. When they take communion, clearly a reference to that. And that's really drove fear that any good Jew's spine. Because ridiculing Catholic practices, which was not just illegal, it was horrifyingly dangerous. It was sakanas nefashos. And that's what the red line they crossed. Yes, of course, the halachic practices were horrific, but they endangered the entire Jewish community when they began to mock Christianity and Roman Catholicism. And therefore, we have a figure of a man by the name of Bishop Dobromsky, and Bishop Dobromsky was informed of this practice that they have to get involved. Just a quick context over here. Officially, when you didn't have the separation of church and state, officially, the Jews were a recognized religion. But within the Jews' recognized religion, they also had to abide by more or less Jewish standards. Now, for the most part, as long as the Jews didn't cause problems, the Catholic Church did not involve itself with Jewish practice. Indeed, the Karaites, Karaim, who basically don't really exist anymore, hardly, maybe they have a shul in Jerusalem, I think you can visit there like a museum. But the Karaites were a force. In fact, in Vilna, here's Vilna up here, in Lithuania, and this was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Karaites existed up until World War II. In fact, by the way, they successfully petitioned Hitler, Yamach Shmo V'Zichro. The Karaites successfully petitioned Hitler, Yamach Shmo, that they are not Jews. And therefore they should not be, their blood is not tainted, they didn't have to be killed. For the most part, they don't exist anymore because they just assimilated into the regular culture. But in the 1700s, the Karaites were also a recognized form of Judaism. But if you could claim that somebody was not a recognized form of religion, that you were not a recognized Catholic, you were not a recognized Jew, then theoretically the Catholic Church could intervene and theoretically burn you at the stake. Theoretically, heresy was punishable by burning at the stake. We're all familiar with Count Potolsky, who was in the 18th century in Vilna, in the time of the Vilna, was burnt at the stake for converting to Judaism. A Catholic converted to Judaism, was burnt at the stake. Here in our shul, every Shavuos, we commemorate the Ger Tzedek, the righteous Gentile from Vilna, the Ger Tzedek Vilna. Shavuos is his yahrzeit. We say a special Kal Molei, which was recited in the main shul in Vilna up until the Holocaust. We started saying it here too. His only sin, his only crime was being a Jew. Now, Rav Yaakov Emden, he for the most part led the battle. Rav Yaakov Emden, for the most part, led the battle. He was a believer. He believed staunchly, remember, and you had the context of him, anything to do with Sabbatianism was to him total treif. But even here, even those moderate anti-Sabbatians, even those people who are moderately anti-Sabbatian, everybody joined forces with Rabbi Yaakov Emden, including Baruch Me'eretz Yavan, who was eventually Mechutin. He was one of the big people in what was called the Vad Arba Aratzos, the Council of the Four Lands, which is a very important rabbinic council, if not for now. But he basically was able to galvanize almost all the religious leadership into saying that the Frankists, what we saw in Lancaronia, the mixture of Christian and Jewish symbols, plus the Sabbatian practices, or the anti-halakhic practices, and the horrific transgressing of normative morality, and the salacious and provocative impropriety which went on there, he was able to galvanize everyone into basically going and trying to convince the Catholic Church itself, that these people are not Jewish. They're not Jewish, they're part of the Erev Rav, and it's clear. In fact, that's why we'll get to in a minute why we question that saying that we meant at the beginning of the lecture about the best, if that's true, which honestly I personally don't believe it's true, but that Rav Yaakov Emden believed that they were descendants of the Erev Rav, with his complete belief, like we quoted at the beginning from Shmuel Yosef Agnon. And these people have to be driven out of Judaism, because they are a fifth column. Now I realize that goes against everything that we do in the 21st century, which is basically just love them. Just love them, no matter who you are, whatever, just love them. But not everyone held just love them in the 18th century. And most people didn't. I don't know if we should always hold in the 21st century. It's another discussion. But he believed that these people were a fifth column embedded in Jews. And if they continue their practices, forget about that many Jews will start practicing these horrific arveros. That's one thing. Forget about that. But they're going to continue, and ultimately they're going to raise the ire of the Catholic Church, and they're going to destroy all of Judaism. Remember, Tach V'Tat, 1648, 1649, was just 100 years before. Maybe 100,000 Jews were killed. And as we know, by the way, many of these same claims that there's something, that they were not, they're Jews, these people, there's something wrong with them. Remember, Hitler Yamach Shvo believed that even if a Jew had one Jewish grandparent, whatever, paternally or maternally, that already marked him as a Jew worthy of being killed. So what they did is that after they appealed, Yaakov Emden and others appealed to the Polish church, they arranged a disputation. It took place in Kamenetz in September 4th, 1756. Just a word to the wise, to my yeshiva friends here, this is not the Kamenetz of Reb Baruch Ber. There are two Kamenetzes. I think there are more than one Brooklyn. We always say Brooklyn, we mean Brooklyn, New York. I think there's Brooklyn's other places. I think there's a Muncie, two Muncies in America, right? We have one Muncie, but they're whatever. So they're, right? Indiana, Muncie, Indiana.
Lakewood is like,
yeah, Lakewood must be tons, right? Lakewood, I imagine, must be tons. Anyway, there's the Kamenetz of Reb Baruch Ber Leibovich. Kamenetz of Reb Baruch Ber Leibovich, which is in Lita, in Lithuania, much further north. And then there's the Kamenetz of Podalia, which is the Kamenetz of Rav Yankel Leibovich, Lahavdil,
That's where the disputation takes place. They organize a debate between the Frankists and Jacob Frank and his people versus the good Jews. Now, word of fact. Jacob Frank has Turkish passport. Once the rabbis told the church that these people, they burnt crosses, Jacob Frank skedoodled quickly out of Poland and skedoodled back to Turkey because these Jews were arrested for being heretics and they could possibly be burnt at the stake. So he quickly didn't want to be burnt, that's for sure. That wasn't he was a martyr for sure, he never was and never will be. So he got back to Turkey. Believe it or not, although he tried to repress it years later, when he gets back to Turkey and he feels that Poland is never going to be a good place for him to make a living as a Mashiach, he actually decides to be the leader of the Don men, and he actually converts to Islam. He puts on a turban, and he would wear that turban for the rest of his life. But we have records of he converts to Islam as he remains in Turkey. So he's not part of the first debate of the Covenants debate. The Covenants debate was, the Frankists said the following. This was their written document that we have preserved they gave to the bishop. We believe in everything it was taught and commanded by God in the Old Testament. The books of Moses and the other books of the Old Testament can be compared to a richly dressed maiden whose face is covered, whose beauty cannot be seen. These books are full of the hidden and wisdom of God. They speak of things mysterious and of the future, and therefore they cannot be comprehended by human reason without the assistance of efficacious divine grace. However, the rabbis of old times sought to expound the Old Testament. These explanations the rabbis gave is known as the Talmud. However, the Talmud, as the rabbis explained it, is full of fables and lies and nonsense. It's hostile to God and His true teaching. So the Talmud, they already claimed, so this was their first starting point. Their first starting point, they also, by the way, they said, we believe that God may take upon Himself mortal human flesh, be born, grow up, eat, drink, sleep, have senses, be subject to all human passions, save for doing sin. We believe that the city of Jerusalem will never be rebuilt. We believe that the Jews are wasting their time, have waited in vain for the Mashiach, and we believe that there was the first sin caused by the first parents, and all those who believe in Him will have eternal grace, and those who do not believe in Him will be cast down to Hell. So, again, we already see that in their first debate, they already are. Now, did they believe it? How much these people believed? I don't know. Did they realize that the cards were stacked against them and therefore they had to find favor in the Catholic Church because they didn't want to be burnt at the stake? I don't know. Whatever it is, this is the first salvo, is that they basically say, we hate the Talmud. So they said two important points. Important point number one was that we're Yidden, we're Jews. But there's three types of Jews. You guys have heard of Karaites and Rabbinites. That you guys know. That your church you know. You know because there are Karaites in Lithuania. That you know. So there are Karaites and Rabbinites. Well, there's a third group. We call ourselves anti-Talmudists or contra-Talmudists. That's what the Polish word translates. Contra-Talmudists. I mean, the rabbis, we're not Karaites, we're not Rabbinites, we're contra-Talmudists. But we're a recognized Jewish. And by the way, we believe in a lot of things like you do too. God can be a human form. God can be flesh. And the Talmud is ridiculous. It's full of lies and fables and deceit and corruption. And so therefore, what they hoped to achieve was that they put forth that, hey, we have, number one is that we're not Talmudic Jews, but we are Jews. Number two, our system of Jewry is actually closer to you guys of Catholicism than the rabbis are. So you got to like us even more. And you know what? They won the debate. They won the debate. They won this debate, and we know that Bishop, on October 17th, 1757, Bishop Dubowski issued a decision declaring the Sabbatians victorious in the Covenants disputation. The consistory court dismissed the rabbis' accusations against them as slander. It imposed a number of financial penalties on the rabbis. and ordered the flogging of all the Jews who were responsible for slandering the good Jews of Lankaroni. They condemned the Talmud, the bishop. They condemned the Talmud as a worthless and corrupt book and ordered it to be consigned to the flames. At that point, Jewish books were brought all over the city square in Kamenetz and publicly burnt by the executioner. Although the verdict of the bishop only Talmuded the Talmud, the people were zealous and they brought Shulchan Aruch, Zohar, commentaries of the Shulchan Aruch. All Jewish books were brought, and Dubansky declared that all sorts of Talmudic study is superstition, is criminal. It teaches one to worship God in a way he should not be worshipped. This was terrible. The assumption is that perhaps 10,000 copies of the Talmud were burned. Indeed, we have one account from a Jewish person who lived at the time, wrote, after the burning of the books ordered by Bishop Dembowski, quote, no Jewish book could be seen all over Poland. Everyone who wanted to save the books had to ship them to Turkey. Probably that's an exaggeration. I'm sure people held on to some Sfarim. But it does give you, even if it's exaggerated, through the exaggeration we have some sort of idea, and this was very terrible. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu never abandoned his people. And even though that was October 17, 1757, everything changed on November 9, 1757. Bishop Dembowski suffered a sudden major stroke and died 3 days later of massive brain hemorrhaging. Jewish sources tell us Dembowski's demise was painful, and it was treated, Rav Yaakov Emden writes, that Dembowski's death was treated as a miracle greater than the one that happened in the times of Haman and Achashverosh. It was greater celebration, more than celebrated Purim that year. According to Jewish sources, before the bishop died, he saw Hebrew letters from the burnt books that he ordered books. He saw the Hebrew letters, and before he died, he canceled his verdict. However, that did not help, and a plague erupted all of Kamenetz, affecting only the Polish Catholic citizens. And the bishop ghost started to haunt all the priests of the town, while people continued to die. Finally, the other bishop declared that Dubansky's corpse had to be dug out, and he had to be decapitated. His head was cut off with a spade. As it says, the head of a sorcerer has to be cut off with an iron tool. However, the plague continued to spread even with the decapitated body, and the bishop ghost kept on appearing with his head under his arm. Well, this is a recording of Yaakov Emden. The terrible phenomenon ceased only after Dembowski's entire corpse was burnt among the ashes of the Talmud in the exact same place. And even, according to Rav Yaakov Emden, even the priest of Kamenetz admitted that Dembowski's terrible death in the plague was a divine punishment for his ordering of the burning of the Talmud. Now, so that was Baruch Hashem, that was good. But unfortunately, things don't end then. Things don't end because even though he was in Turkey, we'll move things along now, in 1757, Frank returns back to Poland. And somehow he's back being a Jew. He has his Turkish turban on his head, but he's there, he's around Podolia, and unfortunately, he begins to get many followers. In fact, he becomes the official leader of the Sabbatians in Podolia. And at this point, the rabbis, especially after Dembowski's death, the rabbis are very, very strong in trying to, the church now is involved, but on their own, of trying to issue very strong charobim, very strong bans of excommunication against the Frankists, and again, doing anything they can in their power to convince the Catholic Church that these people are not authentic Jews, and therefore they should be punished as such. And here's where, unfortunately, everything changes. So Frank is returns in 1758 to Poland, and he begins to lead people. Now, at this time, he's under extreme pressure. He's under extreme pressure from the Jewish people who's told that he's an evil person, leading Jewish people astray. And the Catholics, especially with Dembowski's death, are not convinced that this person also should be. So here's, unfortunately, where a number of factors come into play, and this is the game changer. Previously, the Frankists always presented themselves as an autonomous group opposed to the power of the rabbis, but remaining a part of the Jewish people and willing to remain Judaism. Although they presented some tenets of the belief similar to Christian, they never accepted Christianity or declared themselves as candidates for conversion or baptism. However, they then went to Bishop Lubienski. Now, Bishop Lubienski was a man who was a noted anti-Semite, and he was one of the biggest people who put forth that horrific claim, which continues to haunt us to this day, that we use blood in our matzahs for Pesach. Now, I wasn't there, and I don't think anyone can answer this question 100%, but was it just a tactical move, strategy by the Frankists to save themselves from the ire of the rabbis and the ire of the Catholic Church? Was it the true belief? But this fellow Lubienski was looking for, and again, I don't think it was ever official papal practice. In fact, I know it wasn't. It was never officially papal practice to believe in the blood libel. The belief that the Jews used blood for the baking of the matzah would never, in fact, there were popes who issued, some were less tolerant, some were turned the other way, but I don't think there was ever a pope who actually declared that the Jews actually used blood, Christian children's blood for their matzahs. There were individual clergy who held that way, but it wasn't official part of the catechisms of Catholic theology. This Lubianski was also a gambler, and he was a lot in debt. And he was looking for an ally, if he could find an ally among the Jews who would support his positions, that could basically detract and distract people away from his problems and rally more people around him. Whatever the reasons are, a second disputation was held in 1759, this time in Lemberg and Lvov, also in Lemberg, and a disputation which was, this time, it was brought by the bishop, perhaps to get allies among the Jews to distract attention from him. Perhaps this is what they believe, but we come to the most tragic and horrific part of our story. And that is, the Frankists stated the following. The Frankists stated, 1, all prophecies about the coming of the Mashiach have already been fulfilled. Since the advent of the true Messiah, sacrifices and ceremonies and all Jewish law have been abolished. Everyone should follow the teaching of the Messiah, whose name is JC. The cross is the sign of the Holy Trinity, and that's the seal of the Messiah. A person can only achieve faith and salvation through baptism. All that is whatever it is. But number 7 is the one that is the scariest of all. Number 7th of the Frankist beliefs is that the Talmud teaches that Jews need Christian blood. And whoever believes in the Talmud is bound by halacha to secure Christian blood for Jewish ritual. Now this was never, ever ever and ever, probably ever again in the history of our people, did a born Jew, align with Christian forces to testify, and to declare that we use Christian blood in our matzahs and in other rituals as well. Now you may ask, what kind of ridiculous assertion is that? So we present document 1. Now before you you have over here, you can see it well, but before you have Titzach Adash Bachab. Titzach Adash Bachab. We're all familiar with Titzach Adash Bachab. We're all familiar with that we all know that from the Haggadah Shel Pesach. And we're all familiar that that's an acrostic which spells Dab, Tzfardea, Kidim, Arov, Dever, Shkid, Barad, Arbeh, Choshek, Makas, Bechoros. Now, why did Rabbi Yehuda give this sibid? Why did he call it this? Why did he give this sibid? I can't tell you. However, the Sabbatians, the Frankists, told under sworn deposition in court in front of the Catholic clergy that this does not stand for Dam, Tzfardea, Kidim, Arov, Dever, Shkid, Barad, Arbeh, Choshek, Makas, Bechoros. It stands for Dalet, Dam, blood, Tzadi, Tzrichim, Chof, Kulanu, Ayin, Al, Dalet, Derech, Shin, Sha'asu, Beis, Ba'oso, Aleph, Ish, Chacham, Yerushalayim. Dam, Tzrichim, Kulanu, we all need blood. Al Derech, in the same manner, Sha'asu, Ba'oso, Ish, as they did to that man. We all know who that man is, right, JC? Ba'oso, Ish, who? Chachamim, Yerushalayim. They said, why did Rabbi Yehuda give this strange acrostic, this strange simanim? And why is it broken into 3 parts? Oh, I'll tell you why. Because the 3 parts represent the Trinity. And in the Trinity, there's a necessity for all Jews to use blood. Dam tzrichim kulanu, we all need blood. For Pesach, Al derech sha'asu ba'oso ish, in the same manner as the Jews bled that man on the cross almost 2,000 years ago. Hu chachamim b'Yerushalayim. Now, obviously, by the way, these people knew something. I mean, they knew something. They knew at Haggadah Shel Pesach, and they knew a little bit of Hebrew. But it didn't end there. You notice in Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, Hilchos Pesach, it says, Mitzvah lachzor achayayin adom. It's a mitzvah to go to get red wine. It's a pasuk. It's a pasuk. The yayin edom is preferable. Said the Frankists, this doesn't mean mitzvah lachzor achayayin adom. This means mitzvah lachzor achayayin edom, of an Edomite, of Esav, of Bnei Esav. It's a mitzvah to get the blood of an Esav man. And finally, they quoted the Taz in Orach Chaim, where the Taz says, Yesh od remez le'edom. There's another remez to Esav. Zeichel Edom, she'aparo shochet b'nei Yisrael. Where it doesn't say in the Torah that Paro ever shechted the Jewish children, that's Rashi, that's the Talmud. The reason the Taz is saying that you need Zeichel Edom is because, the real reason is because that it's a remez le'edom. It's a remez to Edom, that the Jewish people, that this was a game changer. This was a game changer, and this obviously, that was it. All deals were off. And this public debate, which took place in the above, there was only one way. There was only one way that the Frankists could go, and there was only one way that the Jewish people would have it. And that is that they had to leave Judaism. They had to leave Judaism, because obviously if you're a Jew, whatever, they certainly weren't going to find too much there in Jews using blood for their matzahs. And B, the Jews themselves, that was obviously a break, and that obviously they couldn't go ahead, and a person could never ever then become part of Judaism after that. And indeed, that's what happened. Indeed, what happened, we know that the Jews right after that, we had that they, in 1759, we know that Frank himself converts, and one of the rulers of Poland, he's the godfather, and his children convert, his wife converts, and a whole unfortunate, again, at that point, probably 2,000 to 3,000 Jews who were followers of Frank, they went ahead and they converted. Ultimately, by the time of his death, the understanding is by the time of his death, about in 1791, about 30,000. We find on the first baptism took place on August 20th. On September 17th, Frank was baptized in Love Cathedral, as was his whole family. And at this point, his at least the story of his involvement of Judaism ends at this point. As at this point, he's obviously no longer a Jew. I mean, halachically, whatever, he could do tshuva, but in part of the Roman Catholic Church, him and his followers, his children, his wife, and many of his followers. What exactly happens? So just quickly with Frank at that point, believe it or not, and we have basically the 1759 as his converts, and from 1759 to 1772 is a third story. What happens is basically right after, in 1760, a few months after his conversion, he's actually turned into the Catholic authorities by Christians. Like he said, he was never really accepted as a Christian by the Christians, who they accused him of being a fake Christian and really observing still Jewish tradition. So he basically had broken his ties with Judaism. He was informed by Catholics who didn't believe that he was really a good Catholic, and they said that he's still practicing Islam, and he once converted, and he really is a Muslim, and that was maybe even worse than being a Jew back then. And he's basically put in the Chechnova monastery. For 13 years, he's imprisoned in this compound, the Chechnova monastery, also in Podolia. Unfortunately, during that time period, he still allowed visitors, and apparently he's living in some sort of compound where he acts like still as a messiah. In fact, some ways his prestige increased during those 13 years, as now he had reached martyr status. His people still came to see him, people provided him with money. Unfortunately, probably more people converted. This goes on until 1772, 1773, which at that point, the Russians, Poland is partially petitioned, and the Russians come. He actually offers himself to convert to Russian Orthodoxy, a different form of Christianity, if he can. Unfortunately, the Jews actually tell the Russians that this guy this is the fifth time he's converting. You know, he went from being a Jew to an Islam to a Sabbatian to a Roman Catholic, and now he's going to be a Russian Orthodoxy. What's next on the list? Anyway, he escapes to Germany. He goes and he makes a quick into Germany, Moravia. He lives in Moravia as well. He's some sort of celebrity. He goes himself as Count von Frank. He calls himself Count von Frank. His daughter Eva, who was reported that was not just a daughter to him, part of his perverted, salacious relationships, she becomes known as the matronusa, the matron. She's the matron of the religion. Her name is really, she's called Eve Frank, she's called. That was really her name. Her name is Rachel, or maybe her name is Sophia. Sophia from the Greek word, like sophistry, wisdom. Like Rabbeinu Yonah writes on Pirkei Avos, Rabbeinu Yonah writes that a person, Edu ha'chacham alomid mikol adam. So he writes like a person should be a philosopher, a philosopher, a lover, a lover of sophistry, which is wisdom. Wisdom. She was called Sophia, wisdom. She was the seed of all wisdom. Frank, whatever, when he's in this chest of a cathedral, there's a portrait there of the Virgin Mary, and he incorporates that into his idea of the Shekhinah, and Eve is part of the Shekhinah. He develops this whole perverted theology. Anyway, he remains in Moravia for a number of years, about 10 years. Finally, he makes his way to Offenbach. Offenbach, he's convinced the authorities, probably obviously a very good convincer. He convinces them to give him a castle. He marches around with soldiers, and the following here, this is when he was in Offenbach. It's called the Gottenhaus of Offenbach. The last quarter of the 18th century, he's Frank. He's living in. He was living in Offenbach. Offenbach is a suburb of Frankfurt. That's where he's living. So he's living the final. Frank was granted the title of Baron, which he used in Offenbach's. Okay. Frank arrived to the city with 5 carriages surrounded by riders, a mounted herald escorted by 2 pages dressed in green and gold. Frank himself was dressed in his high fur cap and a long red cape adorned by a diamond-studded clasp, followed by a coach pulled by 6 horses. His coach was followed by another carrying Eve, who wore a costly green dress embroidered with pearls and diamonds. Again, the Frankist life in Offenbach began to follow a strict regime. He went ahead a yard in front of the building, became a parade ground on which military maneuvers were executed. Every day, young Frankists would be seen training with weapons. Every day at 4 o'clock, a carriage left the castle for the nearby forest where religious ceremonies were conducted. The carriage was accompanied by children wearing red and white turbans, by armed pages in Polish Hungarian uniforms. The whole parade was led by a waterman who sprinkled water in front of Frank's coach. The windows of Frank's coach and his daughter Eve's coach were covered with curtains. One day the curtains were drawn back, and Frank was seen wearing the attire of the Jewish high priest, the Kohen Gadol, including of the Urim V'Tumim on his chest. Can't make this stuff up. Because there was no Roman Catholic Church in Offenbach. Germany is a predominantly Protestant country, but not totally, it's like 60-40. It's predominantly Protestant. Because there was no Roman Catholic Church in Offenbach, Frank used to travel to the nearby village of Burgau on Sundays and Catholic holidays. However, when he would use the chapel, armed sentries barred outsiders from entry. Even during the service, the Catholic service, Frank never bared his head. He went to the mikveh each and every day. In the summer, he would bathe, he would immerse in the river Main. And in the winter, he had a private mikveh, which he refused to share with either Jews or Christians. So, again, he was no longer involved with Jews, but apparently this air of aristocracy remained with him, and he was able, I guess he was bottom line, he was a good con man. Bottom line, he was a very, very good con man. In 1791, he has a stroke and he dies. His daughter, Eva, who would, by the way, always sign her name Eva Romanov, she actually, she convinced people that she was the illicit daughter of one of the Romanov, that's the Russian royal family, that she was actually a Romanov. But after they would collect, she would call herself Lady Eve von Frank. That's how she signed her name. She was a socialite, and her manners were that of a born princess, as people who saw her. She was part of the Polish nobility. Unfortunately, after his death, the main attraction was gone. Eve tried to hold on to the charade, or whatever you want to call it, for a while, until she dies on September 7th, 1816. At the time of her death, her debt reached 800,000 guldens. Again, I have no idea that's a lot, but I assume it is. Anyway, it's interesting to note just one more caveat before we wrap up, and that is that when he was in Moravia, before he went to Offenbach and became the Gottenhaus in Offenbach, so Moravia is by the Czech border. And he actually had people convert or join his movement from Prague. Now, interestingly enough, these Prague people who joined him as Frankists, they per se never converted. They were, for the most part, they were upper class, upper middle class. They were from the bourgeois. They were people who were acclimated, acculturated, and indeed, you should know that in many circles, even someone like the famous Jewish scholar Gershon Sholem looked at Frank in a certain ways, leaving out his Gilui Arais, his sexual proprieties, as sort of like a trailblazer as a libertine who's allowing more liberty, more openness, more acceptability of different lifestyles, etc. So therefore, he had a certain appeal to a certain assimilated Jewish crowd in Moravia, Czechoslovakia. Many of them never converted, but they actually held themselves, they retained Judaism, but secular Judaism. The reason I mention that is because if you look up the biography of the first associate justice, the first Jewish justice, I believe it was the first Jewish justice in the United States Supreme Court, was Justice Brandeis. I believe he was the first. Justice Brandeis was very proud that he was a descendant of Frankists Jews. He was part of the Moravian, the Prague crowd, the Prague Chevra, that I don't know how much they took on the theology of Frank or the permissibility of Frank, but the bourgeois or the aristocracy of the movement, he held himself to be a very proud Jewish Frankist family. Whether it's true or not, I can't tell you. But basically, one thing is clear. By the mid-1800s, if you claimed you were a Frankist, unless, again, that small minority in Prague, but if you claimed you were a Frankist living in Poland, where basically, if the figure is true, those 30,000 Jews converted lived, you were a Catholic. There are no Jewish Frankists anymore. There are no Frankists anymore. There are no people who believe in Jacob Frank. There are very few people in the world who even heard of Frank. Ultimately, he was successful, and so was Rav Yaakov Emden. Jacob Frank and Rav Yaakov Emden, lahavdil, were successful. Jacob Frank in achieving his goal of becoming this Roman Catholic, and Yaakov Emden was successful in cutting off this basically sickened limb, which he believed were descended from the Erev Rav, of eliminating them from the Jewish people, which he believed was divine providence and a reason to celebrate, as indeed they constituted a fifth column, which could also only spread their rancid and incendiary beliefs and unfortunately pollute the entire Jewish people. So we began originally with the statement from the Besht, where the Baal Shem Tov supposedly said that the Shechina is crying because as long as an aver, as long as a part is still part of the body, there's hope. But once it gets cut off, there is no more hope. And as I mentioned back then, there are those who claim, Rav Agno and many others who claim that the Besht never said. In fact, there are those who claim, frankly, just the opposite, that the Besht actually was one of the participants in the famous Lvov-Lemberg debate of 1759, and he wanted them out of the religion. Whatever it is, it's a sad story, because no doubt some of these Jews, who probably many of them who converted, were led astray by a very evil man, by a man who took probably many Jews whose birthright was as Jewishly valid and authentic as mine and yours, and led them astray into Roman Catholicism. What lessons can we take from here? Besides the obvious lesson of the sadness of the entire story, of the tremendous tragedy of the story of Gullus, the story of Gullus without a land, without a homeland, without a central place of worship, without a clear clarity of Torah wisdom, how unfortunately all disinformation, quote unquote, fake news can become the reality, conspiracy theories can become the reality, and false messiahs can be popular figures, unfortunately causing the conversion of 30,000 Jews away from Yiddishkeit. And that's certainly something to be sad about, and are hoping for the proper Mashiach to come speedily in our times. But there's also another message. There's also probably the message of, honestly, of not involving non-Jewish forces, non-Jewish sources, and non-Jewish individuals in our business, in what we do. Unfortunately, the involvement of the Catholic Church, although they may have converted anyway for all we know, but the involvement of the Catholic Church certainly forced a hand. And if there was any hope of salvation and any hope of them leaving radical Sabbatianism and returning to the fold, obviously, once the involvement of the Catholic Church and the accusations and the disputations, that opportunity and that possibility was no longer on the table. But finally, I do want to, and I gave this thought, and I just like to put out there something for each and every one of us. And that is that, very often in life, it's probably a knee-jerk natural reaction, probably inborn. But generally, there's no lack of people who we blame for our problems. And there's no lack of people who we blame for what's wrong in this world. Conspiracy theories abound, but they always have one thing in common, that it's always someone else. Whoever ever took a guess, which in itself I think is somewhat sacrilegious, but whoever ever attempts to discover the reason for any sort of Jewish tragedy, be it the Holocaust, be it the Crusades, be it the Inquisition, is almost always for sure to point that it was that group's fault or that group's fault. That sect or their belief and that belief. But it's never a look in the mirror. A look in the mirror is never in our purview, and we never really, it's always what that other person is doing or what they're doing to destroy. What hit me more in the story of Jacob Frank is that maybe just love them is right, maybe it's not. It's a different discussion. It's a debatable point. Obviously, never say always and never say never. But perhaps there's something that we can always use in our lives as well. And that is that, as I mentioned this morning, and I'll mention just again now in closing, that we have free choice in this world. And we are responsible for our actions. And we are accountable for our actions. And each one of us, we believe be'emunah shlema, that we have free choice. I'm not saying circumstances don't impact on the decisions, they certainly do. I'm not saying the complexity of life's challenges sometimes makes choices almost impossible. I'm fully aware of that, fully aware. But nevertheless, perhaps when we look at this story, we realize the potential for harm that one person can bring in this world. Even if we celebrate their removal from the Jewish people, but the reality is that it's impossible that there wasn't collateral damage. It's impossible to state that all 30,000 of these converts were all descendants of the Erev Rav. That just seems too unbelievable to imagine. And ultimately our actions count, and what we do impacts not only on ourselves and our small group of people, but it impacts on all those around us. And that's all we can do. And all we can do in this world is to try to take care of ourselves and try to recognize that what we do impacts on others. When we act in a positive way, we can make the world a positive place for all those around us. They say that Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, who certainly understood the importance of his actions and the ramifications. He was so careful in them. But he once got up to eulogize a certain man who was a businessman, an honest businessman. And he said how wonderful the man did and what an impact he had on the community. And then he asked a question in the middle of his eulogy, which he answered himself. The question that he asked, he said that some here may be wondering, this man was not a teacher of Torah. This man was not a Rebbe, a Rav, a Rosh Hashiva, a Kiruv person. In what way did he teach? In what way was he impactful? So Moshe Feinstein answered his own question that every single day, every one of us here in this room, we said it today, notwithstanding Tisha B'Av, we said it today. Put in our hearts, lil modul lalamed. Put in our hearts to learn and to teach and to fulfill. Asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, why do we ask to teach? Let's say I'm not a teacher. Let's say I'm not a Rebbe. Why should I excise that word from my tefillah? Answered Rav Moshe Feinstein, no. Because every one of us is a teacher. Every one of us is teaching all those around us how we act. Each one of us is an example of how a Jew should react to the person sitting next to you in shul, to the person walking across from you in the street. The Chazon Ish, as great as he would specifically wear his eyeglasses, that he would be able never to not notice a person, that somebody shouldn't say that I passed the Chazon Ish and he didn't notice me in the street, notwithstanding other dangers that may have been involved, never to hurt another human being. He understood that even by our actions we are teaching, we are impacting. We have a impact, and we are changing this world either for good or for bad. Obviously, this story is a story of one person who chose to impact the world in a very unfavorable fashion. It's only up to us to impact, to change, to impress everyone, ourselves and all those around us, to show the beauty of Yehadus, to show the beauty of Torah, to be involved in Chesed. And in doing so, Be'ezus Hashem, we should be Zocha, we should be privileged that this should be the last fast of Tisha B'Av. We should be privileged for Bias B'Shiach Tzidkenu B'mehera V'Yameinu. Amen. V'Amen. Thank you so much for listening.